In August of 1836, two brothers from New York paid $5,000 for 6,600 acres of mud. The land sat along a sluggish, tree-choked waterway called Buffalo Bayou, about 50 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, in a part of southeast Texas so hot, so humid, and so thick with mosquitoes that even the Karankawa people had mostly avoided settling there permanently. The soil was black clay that turned to swamp when it rained, which it did constantly. There was no harbor. There was no high ground. There was nothing resembling a navigable river, unless you were willing to use the word very generously. And 5 days after Augustus and John Allen closed on the land, they placed an advertisement in the Telegraph and Texas Register, one of the only newspapers in the brand new Republic of Texas, declaring that they had founded a city. They named it Houston, after the hero of the Battle of San Jacinto, and they described it like this: beautifully elevated, salubrious, and well-watered, destined by nature itself to be the future seat of government. The ad included an illustration of the town site nestled among towering hills. There are no hills within 100 miles of Houston. The ad worked. Settlers came. What they found when they arrived was not what the advertisement had described. Francis Richard Lubbock, who would later become governor of Texas, recalled that when he first reached Houston in 1837, the town site consisted of a handful of tents and rough-hewn shelters scattered in the mud. The first steamboat to reach the settlement, the Laura, on January 22, 1837, had to fight its way up Buffalo Bayou through overhanging trees and sandbars. Gale Borden, the publisher who had surveyed the town site and who would later become famous for inventing condensed milk, laid out the streets in a grid. Texas Avenue, the western boundary, was platted 100 feet wide enough to accommodate cattle drives. The street names read like a roll call of the Revolution: Travis, Fannin, Rusk, Lamar. It was a city on paper. On the ground, it was a muddy clearing full of optimists and mosquitoes. That advertisement may be the most consequential real estate lie in American history. Not because the Allen brothers got rich. Augustus lived another 28 years, but John died of a fever in 1838, at 28, barely 2 years after the founding, but because every generation of Houstonians that followed would do essentially the same thing the Allens did. They would look at what Houston actually was, decide it wasn't good enough, and then spend enormous sums of money to make reality match their ambition. The Allens lied about a city. Their successors built one. To understand how improbable Houston is, you first have to understand what was supposed to happen. 50 miles to the southeast, sitting right on the Gulf of Mexico, was Galveston Island. Galveston had everything Houston didn't: a natural deep-water harbor, direct access to the open ocean, sea breezes, and by the 1870s, real wealth. The Strand, Galveston's main commercial street, was called the Wall Street of the Southwest. Fortunes were made there in cotton, banking, shipping, and insurance. By 1899, Galveston had more millionaires per capita than almost any city in the United States. It had the first telegraph in Texas, the first telephone, the first electric lights. 60% of the state's cotton crop passed through its port. If you had asked anyone in Texas in 1895 which Gulf Coast city would dominate the 20th century, they would have looked at you as though the question were absurd. Galveston was the queen. Houston was the supply town in the swamp behind her. And the Allen brothers' original gambit, it worked, briefly. They offered the new Republic of Texas free office space and a building for the capital, and in late 1836, the Texas Congress accepted. Houston became the capital of the Republic. It lasted 2 years. The capital moved to Austin in 1839. And the Allens were left with a small town of a couple thousand people, surrounded by mud and mosquitoes, its one real claim to importance already gone. John was already dead. Augustus eventually divorced his wife Charlotte, whose inheritance had financed the original land purchase, and drifted into obscurity. The brothers had created a city, but they hadn't created a reason for it to exist. What saved Houston, in the beginning, was not vision, but geography of a different kind. The flat prairies spreading out in every direction from Buffalo Bayou turned out to be extraordinary cotton land. By the early 1850s, wagons loaded with cotton bales were rolling into Houston from plantations across southeast Texas. The Telegraph reported that 4,000 bales arrived in a single 2-week period in 1855, hauled by 670 ox wagons and thousands of oxen. Thomas W. House, who had started as a junior partner in a small business and married his partner's daughter, built an empire in cotton, banking, and real estate. He invested in railroads, helped start a church and the city's first volunteer fire company, and became the prototype for a species of Houstonian that would recur for the next century and a half. The businessman who builds the city as a side effect of building his fortune. More than 1 in 5 people in Houston at that time were enslaved, and much of the city's early wealth was built on their labor, in the fields and on the docks along Buffalo Bayou, loading bales onto boats and wagons. But cotton needed to get to market, and Houston's great early advantage was that it sat at a crossroads. In 1853, the Buffalo Bayou, Brazos, and Colorado Railroad inaugurated the first 20 miles of railroad track in Texas, originating from Houston's doorstep. Other lines followed quickly. By the time the Civil War interrupted everything, Houston was already becoming what it would remain for decades, a junction. Not the destination, that was Galveston, where the ships were, but the hub where railroads met, where cotton changed hands, where deals were struck before the goods moved on to the coast. It was an inland switch yard, and it thrived as one. By 1900, 17 major railroads met in Houston. The population had reached 44,000, nearly double what it had been a decade before. And then, in 4 months, 2 events occurred that would make Houston the most important city in the American South, and both of them happened somewhere else. On September 8, 1900, a Category 4 hurricane struck Galveston. The storm surge rose over 15 feet, sweeping across an island that sat barely above sea level. Somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people died. The exact number was never established because entire families were swept away with no one left to report them missing. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Entire neighborhoods vanished. The grand Victorian mansions along Broadway survived, but the working-class wards to the south were obliterated. 2/3 of the city's structures were damaged or destroyed. The wharves that had made Galveston the Wall Street of the Southwest were torn apart. The city would rebuild. Galvestonians undertook one of the most extraordinary engineering projects in American history, raising the entire grade level of the city by as much as 17 feet and erecting a 10-mile seawall along the Gulf side. But investors were shaken in a way that could not be engineered away. Capital is, above all things, allergic to risk. And an island barely above the waterline that had just been obliterated by a hurricane was, to a banker considering where to build a refinery or park a corporate headquarters, a fundamentally different proposition than it had been on September 7th. The money didn't leave Galveston all at once, but it began to look inland. It began to look at Houston. 4 months later and 80 miles to the northeast, on January 10, 1901, a drilling crew near Beaumont, Texas, hit oil at a depth of 1,139 feet on a low rise called Spindletop Hill. At about 10:30 in the morning, mud began bubbling from the hole. The startled roughnecks fled as 6 tons of 4-inch drilling pipe came shooting up out of the ground like a javelin. Several minutes of silence followed, the kind of silence that precedes either nothing or everything. Then mud, then gas, then a geyser of crude oil that rocketed over 100 feet into the air, higher than the derrick itself, and kept going for 9 days before anyone could cap it. The Lucas Gusher, as it was called, produced an estimated 100,000 barrels of oil a day. To put that in perspective, the entire state of Texas had produced 836,000 barrels in the whole of the previous year. Spindletop could match that in 9 days. In its first year, the field would produce more oil than any deposit ever discovered in America. 2 of the companies formed to exploit it, Texaco and Gulf Oil, would become titans of the 20th century. People who had been farming or cutting lumber the week before were millionaires by spring. Spindletop was in Beaumont, not Houston. But Houston was 60 miles closer to Spindletop than Galveston was, and Houston was inland, and Houston was a railroad hub, and Houston had bankers and lawyers and land, and Galveston had just been flattened by a hurricane. The oil companies looked at both cities and made a choice. Within a few years, oil company offices were opening across downtown Houston. The Humble Oil Company, founded in 1911 in a small town northeast of Houston, moved its headquarters downtown by 1921 and would eventually become Exxon. Houston hadn't discovered the oil. It hadn't drilled the oil. It simply captured the business of oil, the leases, the financing, the refining logistics, the executive offices, the way a port captures trade. It was the Allen brothers trick all over again. If the thing you need doesn't exist where you are, find a way to bring it to you. But the most audacious act of geographic defiance was still to come. Houston was an inland city. It had no harbor. It sat on a bayou that was, in many stretches, less than 10 feet deep and barely 70 feet wide. And the men running Houston looked at that bayou and decided it was going to be an ocean port. The idea of dredging Buffalo Bayou into a navigable channel had been floating around since the 1870s, and the Army Corps of Engineers had been making modest improvements for decades. By 1909, the channel had been dredged to about 18.5 feet, deep enough for barges, not nearly deep enough for ocean-going ships. That year, Houston's mayor, Horace Baldwin Rice, led a delegation to Washington with a proposal that had never been attempted before. The city would pay half the cost of dredging the channel to 25 feet if the federal government paid the other half. It was called the Houston Plan, and it was the first time a local government had offered to split a federal waterway project. Before Houston's offer, no American city had ever put up its own money to dig its own port. Congress accepted. Harris County citizens formed a navigation district and approved a bond issue of $1,250,000. Jesse Holman Jones, a name that will matter enormously in a moment, arranged for the sale of those bonds. Jones also played a leading role in lobbying his fellow Houston bankers to buy them when outside investors hesitated. The dredging began. On September 7, 1914, the dredging vessel Texas signaled by whistle that the channel was complete. The formal opening came on November 19th, when President Woodrow Wilson, sitting at his desk in the White House, pressed an ivory button that was wired by telegraph to a cannon in Houston. The cannon fired. A young woman named Sue Campbell sprinkled white roses into the water. Crowds cheered along the turning basin. Houston had been waiting for this moment for 78 years. What had been achieved was, by any engineering standard, remarkable. Houston had built itself a 50-mile-long artificial seaport, carving a navigable lane through Galveston Bay and up the San Jacinto River to a turning basin just east of downtown. The channel was 25 feet deep and 150 feet wide, big enough for the ocean-going vessels of 1914, though not for what would come later. It would be deepened and widened repeatedly in the decades ahead, to 30 feet, then 34, then 40, then 45, eventually stretching to a width of 530 feet, until it became one of the busiest waterways in the United States, a 52-mile industrial corridor lined with docks, tank farms, and loading cranes. A city with no natural harbor had, through sheer expenditure and engineering, given itself a port that would one day rank first in the nation in waterborne tonnage. The Allen brothers' original lie, that Houston was located on a navigable waterway destined for great commerce, had taken 78 years, but it had come true. The ship channel opened the same year Jesse Jones opened the Rice Hotel. Everything was accelerating at once. And now we need to talk about Jesse Jones, because if the Allen brothers are the men who invented Houston, Jesse Jones is the man who built it. Jones arrived in Houston from Tennessee in 1898 at the age of 24 with an 8th grade education and an uncle in the lumber business. He started managing his uncle's lumber yard, then began building houses, then commercial buildings. He was shrewd, relentless, and understood something that many developers never learn, that the value of a building is determined not just by what's inside it, but by what's around it. Jones didn't just build structures, he built clusters. He built a hotel across the street from an office building, and a theater around the corner, and a bank on the next block, and all of them fed customers to each other. By the time the panic of 1907 swept the country, Jones was secure enough to do something that astonished Houston. He announced that he would construct the city's 3 tallest buildings all at once: a 10-story office building for Texaco, a 10-story building for his newspaper, the Houston Chronicle, which would give Jones partial ownership of the paper, and a 9-story luxury hotel called the Bristol. While the rest of the country was retrenching, Jones was pouring concrete. He had learned a lesson from the panic that would serve him for life. If you keep your debts manageable, a crisis is an opportunity. In 1913, Jones opened the Rice Hotel at 909 Texas Avenue on the very site where the capital of the Republic of Texas had stood, on the very block where Charlotte Allen, Augustus's wife, had once lived in a wooden house. The Rice was 17 stories tall, with 680 rooms, the largest hotel in Texas. It was designed by the firm of Morin, Russell, and Crowell, with the Houston architect Alfred C. Finn managing the project. The Rice became the semi-official hotel of Houston, the place where deals were struck and conventions held and visiting dignitaries housed, and it would serve that function for more than 60 years. Jones expanded it with a new wing in 1925 and kept expanding his empire around it. The Lamar Hotel, the Texas State Hotel, the San Jacinto Hotel. He built theaters, the Metropolitan Loews, where a generation of Houstonians would take the bus downtown on Saturday nights. He became sole owner of the Houston Chronicle in 1926. He was the publisher, the hotelier, the banker, and the builder, all at once. And downtown Houston was, to an uncomfortable degree, the physical expression of one man's ambition. In 1928, Jones pulled off something that seemed impossible for a southern city. He brought the Democratic National Convention to Houston. It was the first national political convention held in the South since before the Civil War. Jones donated $200,000 of his own money, served as the finance director, and personally promised to build a convention hall. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Houston, the city that had been a muddy clearing 90 years earlier, was now hosting a presidential nominating convention. The country was paying attention. His masterpiece was the Gulf Building at 712 Main Street. Designed by Finn along with Kenneth Fransheim and J.E.R. Carpenter, it opened in 1929, 37 stories, 430 feet, the tallest building in Houston. It was an Art Deco tower faced in limestone, and it rose from the very lot where Charlotte Allen's wooden house had been demolished 18 years earlier. Jones had essentially erased the frontier and replaced it with a skyline. The Gulf Building would remain the tallest structure in Houston for 34 years. But Jones's most important contribution to Houston may have happened not with concrete, but with a telephone call. In 1931, as the Great Depression tightened its grip, two Houston banks were on the verge of failing, and their collapse would have dragged every other bank in the city down with them. Jones called the city's leading businessmen to his office and brokered a rescue. The stable banks and several local companies would absorb the failing institutions. It worked. Not a single bank in Houston failed during the Great Depression. Not one. In a decade when banks were closing across the country by the thousands, Houston's banking system held. That accomplishment caught the attention of President Herbert Hoover, who appointed Jones to the newly created Reconstruction Finance Corporation. When Franklin Roosevelt took office and expanded the RFC into the most powerful economic instrument in the federal government, he elevated Jones to chairman. For more than a decade, Jesse Jones directed billions of dollars, tens of billions in today's money, toward banks, railroads, farms, and industries across the country. He had almost complete autonomy in deciding where the government's money should go, and he parceled it out not as charity, but as investment, buying stock in struggling enterprises and demanding a voice in how they were run. Time magazine called him the second most powerful man in Washington. During World War II, Roosevelt made him Secretary of Commerce while he continued to oversee the RFC and more than 30 related agencies. His book about the experience was titled, Without False Modesty, $50 Billion. A man who had arrived in Houston with an 8th grade education was now, in the estimation of many observers, responsible for saving American capitalism. And the city he had built had followed him to the national stage. Jones returned to Houston in 1945. After Roosevelt asked for his resignation to make room for Henry Wallace. He managed his properties and his philanthropy until his death in 1956. Meanwhile, something was happening along the ship channel that would reshape Houston's economy more profoundly than any skyscraper. The oil flowing through the channel needed to be refined, and the flat, cheap land along its banks was ideal for refineries and petrochemical plants. When the Houston Ship Channel had opened in 1914, there were almost no industries on its banks. Within 2 decades, the corridor was lined with tank farms and processing facilities. Humble Oil built a massive refinery at Baytown. Shell, Sinclair, and Crown Central followed. By the time World War II demanded vast quantities of fuel, synthetic rubber, and industrial chemicals, the Ship Channel corridor had become one of the largest concentrations of petrochemical production on Earth. The federal government, through the very RFC that Jones had chaired, built synthetic rubber plants along the channel to replace the natural rubber supplies that Japan had cut off in Southeast Asia. Houston didn't just supply the war effort, it supplied the materials that made the war effort possible. The city's population, which had been 384,000 in 1940, reached nearly 600,000 by 1950, a 55% increase in a single decade. People came for the jobs, and the jobs kept multiplying. And there was another force at work, quieter, but ultimately just as transformative. The Rice Hotel cafeteria had been air-conditioned as early as 1922, one of the first cooled commercial spaces in Houston. But residential and widespread commercial air conditioning didn't arrive until after the war, when window units became cheap enough for ordinary consumers. In the 1950s, the sought-after new ranch houses with their low ceilings were far easier to cool than the high-ceilinged homes of earlier decades, and developers built them by the thousands. The effect was staggering. Houston had always been a city that people endured rather than enjoyed for roughly 5 months of the year. The heat was brutal, the humidity suffocating, the mosquitoes legendary. Air conditioning didn't merely make Houston more comfortable, it made Houston possible. One historian described the post-war migration to Sunbelt cities like Houston as the largest internal migration in American history, driven in significant part by the simple fact that you could now live in places that were previously uninhabitable for anyone who worked indoors. Houston's population nearly doubled again between 1950 and 1960, from 596,000 to 938,000. The city had cracked 1 million people by the late 1960s. In the middle of that boom, 2 institutions arrived that would diversify Houston's economy beyond oil in ways that even Jesse Jones might not have predicted. The Texas Medical Center, established in 1945 with funds from the M.D. Anderson Foundation, grew from a handful of hospitals into the largest medical complex in the world, a sprawling campus in south-central Houston that would eventually receive over 160,000 daily visitors and rank as the 8th largest business district in the United States. Monroe Dunaway Anderson, the cotton trader from Tennessee whose endowment made it possible, had arrived in Houston in 1907, drawn by the same forces that drew everyone. The city was growing, money was moving, and there was room. His foundation's first gift had been a $1,000 check for eyeglasses. Within a few decades, his name would be on one of the most important cancer research hospitals on Earth. And then, in 1961, NASA came to town. The story of how Houston became Space City is, in its essentials, another story about Houstonians refusing to accept that something should happen somewhere else. When NASA needed a site for its new manned spacecraft center, the facility that would manage all future crewed space missions, the agency drew up criteria: mild climate, water access, proximity to universities, available land. 23 cities were evaluated. But the political weight on Houston's side of the scale was extraordinary. Congressman Albert Thomas, a Rice University alumnus, chaired the House Appropriations Subcommittee that controlled NASA's budget. Vice President Lyndon Johnson chaired the National Aeronautics and Space Council. George R. Brown, chairman of Rice University's board, and Thomas's former college roommate, had been working behind the scenes since 1958. Rice offered 1,000 acres of cattle pasture southeast of the city as a gift to the federal government. On September 19, 1961, NASA Administrator James Webb announced that the Manned Spacecraft Center would be built in Houston. The $60 million facility opened in 1964. On September 12, 1962, President Kennedy stood in Rice Stadium, in the Houston heat before 35,000 people, and delivered the words, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." 7 years later, when Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar surface, his first word was the name of the city: Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That same decade, Houston built something that, in its own peculiar way, represented the city's personality as perfectly as the Ship Channel or the Space Center. Judge Roy Hofheinz, a former Houston mayor, a county judge, a man of almost comical ambition, had been obsessing for years over the problem of outdoor sports in a city where the summer heat could reach 105 degrees. He claimed to have been inspired by the velarium, the retractable awning that Roman slaves unfurled to shade the Colosseum. If those Romans can put a lid on their stadium, Hofheinz reportedly said, so can we. In the early 1960s, he paid $5 million for 495 acres of swampland 6 miles south of downtown, spent another $1.5 million to drain it, and then sold a portion to Harris County as the site for his dream. The Houston Astrodome opened on April 9, 1965, with an exhibition game between the Astros and the New York Yankees. Mickey Mantle hit the first home run. The dome was 642 feet across, 213 feet high, and covered 9 acres of playing field. It had cost somewhere around $45 million in 1960s money, funded largely by public bonds, and it was the first fully enclosed, air-conditioned, multi-purpose stadium ever built. Billy Graham came to preach there and called it the eighth wonder of the world, and Houstonians adopted the phrase with unironic pride. The Astrodome had a problem nobody had anticipated. The 4,000 skylights in the roof, designed to let natural grass grow on the field, created such blinding glare that outfielders couldn't track fly balls. Work crews painted the skylights over, which killed the grass, which led to the installation of a new synthetic surface, branded inevitably as AstroTurf. A generation of professional athletes would blame their ruined knees on that surface. Houston had built an indoor stadium so ambitious that it invented a new category of sports injury. By the early 1970s, Houston was booming in a way that made its earlier booms look like rehearsals. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 and the Iranian Revolution of 1979 drove oil prices to heights that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Money poured into Texas. People flooded into Houston from Michigan, from Ohio, from every state where factories were closing and winter was long. The city's population grew by 27% in the 1970s alone. There were bidding wars on apartments. New arrivals slept in their cars while waiting for units to open up. Construction cranes swung over downtown like metronomes. Glass and steel office towers rose along streets that Jesse Jones would not have recognized, pushing south and west from the old Main Street corridor where the Gulf Building still stood, dwarfed now by structures twice its height. In 1963, Humble Oil, the company that had started with $150,000 in capital in 1911, had moved into a new 45-story headquarters at 800 Bell Street, more than 600 feet tall, the tallest building west of the Mississippi at the time. It was a vertical monument to what oil money could do when concentrated in one place. Houston passed the 1.5 million mark. It was the 5th largest city in America, and it carried itself with the confidence of a place that believed it had figured out something the rest of the country hadn't. Houston thought we were the smartest people on the earth at that time, an economist at the University of Houston later said, and had everything figured out, and the rest of the country just didn't know how to run their business. The bust, when it came, was savage. It started with the recession of 1982. Oil prices, which had seemed destined to climb forever, softened, then dropped, then collapsed, falling by more than 50% by 1986. And it turned out that much of what had been built in Houston during the boom was built on debt, on leverage, on the assumption that oil would never go below $30 a barrel. The banks had lent freely to developers who had built for newcomers who were now leaving. Houston lost 211,000 jobs between February 1982 and March 1987. 1 in 8 Houstonians was unemployed. Tent cities appeared on vacant lots. The real estate market didn't just soften, it cratered. Close to 200,000 homes stood empty. People who had moved down from Michigan and Ohio gave their house keys to the bank and drove back north because there was, as one economist put it, simply no work here. The banks themselves, over-leveraged on real estate loans, began to fail, dozens of them across Texas, in one of the worst banking collapses since the Depression. The Houston Opera offered free season tickets to patrons who had lost their jobs. Restaurants closed, car dealerships closed, even the former governor of Texas, John Connally, the man who had been riding in the car with President Kennedy in Dallas, went bankrupt. A bumper sticker circulated through the city that read, "Lord, give me another oil boom. I promise not to piss it up this time." In September 1986, the New York Times sent a reporter to Houston to survey the damage, and he came back with a line that captured something true. For all its troubles, perhaps because of them, Houston seems a more human place. What the bust revealed was something Houston had been reluctant to admit during the good times, A city of more than 1 million people cannot survive on one industry, no matter how profitable that industry is. The decades after the crash were, in a sense, the most important in Houston's history because they were the decades when Houston stopped being an oil city and became simply a city. The Texas Medical Center continued to expand. In 1969, Dr. Denton Cooley had performed the first total artificial heart transplant there, and the complex kept attracting researchers and patients from around the world. NASA continued to operate, and Mission Control in Houston remained the nerve center of American crewed spaceflight. The port, that improbable 50-mile ditch that the Allen brothers had imagined and Jesse Jones had financed, continued to be one of the busiest in the nation, handling petrochemicals but also containers, grain, steel, and goods from every corner of the world. Community leaders who had never spoken to each other before the bust were forced to work together, and the networks they built proved durable. Houston's economy diversified not because anyone planned it exactly, but because the infrastructure that oil money had built turned out to be useful for other things. The city that had been the energy capital of the world quietly became a capital of medicine, of shipping, of aerospace, of international trade. And Houston kept doing what Houston had always done. It kept growing. The city never adopted zoning laws. Voters rejected the idea in 1948, again in 1962, and by fewer than 7,000 votes in 1993. It remains to this day the largest city in America with no comprehensive zoning code. A strip club can open next to a church. A chemical plant can sit across the street from a subdivision. A gleaming high-rise can rise beside a taqueria in a converted gas station. The result is a city that looks to outsiders like chaos. A sprawling, centerless, anarchic expanse of freeways and strip malls and parking lots and glass towers, all jumbled together without apparent logic. To Houstonians, it looks like freedom. The absence of zoning made housing cheap, construction fast, and development nearly frictionless. When people needed homes, homes got built. No hearings, no review boards, no neighbors arguing for 2 years about whether a project would change the character of the street. When businesses needed space, space appeared. The city spread outward across the coastal prairie in every direction, annexing land, swallowing suburbs, growing to nearly 600 square miles, an area larger than the entire city of Los Angeles. It is a place designed, if that's the word, by the cumulative decisions of millions of individuals acting in their own interest. The founding philosophy of the Allen brothers, sell the land, let people build what they want, never really changed. The Rice Hotel closed in 1977 after 64 years. It stood vacant for 21 years, its lobby silent, its 680 rooms empty. The building where Jesse Jones had once held court reduced to a shell on a block that downtown Houston had mostly abandoned. In 1998, it reopened as apartment lofts. Today, it's simply called The Rice, and young professionals live in the rooms where oilmen once struck deals and politicians once plotted campaigns. The Astrodome, the eighth wonder of the world, hosted its last professional football game in 1996 and its last baseball game in 1999. The Astros moved to a new stadium. The Oilers moved to Tennessee. Voters rejected a $217 million bond to renovate the building. It still stands, adjacent to the newer NRG Stadium, empty and slowly deteriorating. Annual maintenance costs $166,000 a year. A $63,000 power wash was required just to clean the black streaks from the exterior. The building that was once the physical embodiment of Houston's audacity, the idea that you could put a roof over the Texas sky, is now a problem no one can solve. Too expensive to fix, too famous to tear down. And yet Houston kept growing. It absorbed Hurricane Harvey in 2017, one of the worst flooding disasters in American history. 51 inches of rain in 4 days, a third of the county underwater, and didn't lose population. It gained roughly 30,000 new residents the following year. The 2020 census counted 2.3 million people within the city limits, fourth largest in America, behind only New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. The metropolitan area exceeded 7 million. The Texas Medical Center had become, without exaggeration, a city within a city. 61 institutions, 106,000 employees, 10 million patient encounters a year. The Port of Houston ranked first in the nation in waterborne tonnage, ahead of New York, ahead of Los Angeles, ahead of every coastal city that had been given by nature what Houston had to build for itself. More than 5,000 energy-related firms still called the city home, but so did the headquarters of 25 Fortune 500 companies spanning industries from groceries to aerospace. Houston, often described as the most ethnically diverse large city in the United States, had become a majority-minority city, with Hispanic and Latino residents constituting the plurality of its population. The city that two brothers from New York had advertised into existence on a mudflat, calling it beautifully elevated, calling it salubrious, calling it destined, had become, against every reasonable prediction, one of the great cities of the Western Hemisphere. Not because the land was good, the land was terrible. Not because the climate was kind, the climate was punishing. Not because it had a natural harbor or a navigable river or a defensible position or any of the things that cities are supposed to have. Houston had none of those things. What Houston had, from the very beginning, was people who looked at what was there, decided it wasn't enough, and then spent whatever it took to make the place into something it had no geographical right to be. They dug a port where there was no harbor. They cooled a city that nature had designed to be uninhabitable. They put a roof over a baseball field in a place where roofs that big were not supposed to be possible. They sent men to the moon from a mission control center built on cattle pasture. And when the one industry that had paid for all of it collapsed, they rebuilt the economy on the fly, without a plan, without zoning, without much of anything except the conviction that whatever Houston needed, Houston would figure out how to get. Buffalo Bayou still runs through the center of the city, as it did when the Allen brothers bought the land along its banks for $5,000. It is cleaner now than it was then, but not by as much as you might hope. It floods regularly. Houston has always flooded, and the paving of 600 square miles of prairie into concrete has made the flooding worse. The bayou is narrow and brown and winding, and if you stand along its banks in the greenway that now runs beside it, you can see the glass towers of downtown reflected in the water when the light is right. Those towers exist because of the bayou. The port exists because of the bayou. The refineries, the chemical plants, the shipping terminals that stretch for 50 miles down to Galveston Bay. All of it follows the course of the same sluggish waterway that Augustus and John Allen once described as a navigable river destined for greatness. They were lying, but they were also, it turned out, exactly right.